here. If it is not here, it's the inexistence of the world. So only by an event can gain some existence. We begin by a question concerning some characteristics of an event. So, and after that we return to the question of death.
Is there, okay, let me begin again. Is there, in your opinion, any intrinsic connection between the unsayable and the event? Can there exist in a poem, play, story, or novel an event, a place, moment of true change that is only made possible precisely because of the silences and absences language allows for?
Your complete words. So the question of relationship between the event and the unsayable is a part, irreducible part of the question of an event, in fact. If there is something like an event, absolutely general situation, we must have something which is unsayable, in fact. Something which is without any name, in some sense, which is unnamed, not only unsayable, but also without any clear connection with existing language. And why? It's because in the common situation, common world, in ordinary world, what exists is always of constructible nature. That is, in the common world, all what exists can be named. It's what, in being an event, I name this situation the encyclopedic situation of the world. Is in the world there is something new, regular change, we cannot have the time to explain. You know, it's simple, regular change is a change which is inside the world. How we can have a change inside the world, we'll explain tomorrow, but regular change is a change which is without any problem inside a different world. So, when something is new by a regular change, that sort of novelty is with its name inside the world. If you have a new invention, I don't speak of truth at all. If you have something new in the world, inside the world, there is always possibilities to name that sort of production with the resource of the common language. But if there is something like an event is outside the common laws of the world. We explain why tomorrow, but it's practically one of the possible definitions of an event, that it's something which happens in the world without a clear correlation between this happening and the laws of the world. So it's a rupture, in some sense, of the laws of the world. Okay. So, generally speaking, there is no name for an event. There is no name is a common language. So, properly, there is a sort of reciprocity, of correlation, as you say, between event and unsayable. And you're attempting to give the example in the artistical field, but it's a general situation. The artistical is clear because it's a fact of language. So the point where the language is not here is inside the work of language is particularly striking. So, but more generally, there is no real name for an event, and and the question is how can we observe this situation of something which happens without name, and the difficulty is what is the difficulty? The difficulty is probably an event disappears. An event is not something which is. An event is something which happens. So there is a beginning of an event, but there is also an end of an event. And maybe sometimes the end is very near the beginning. It's like a sudden light, if you want. Maybe the most striking example is a love encounter. Because just after you encounter, it's a new situation. You cannot repeat the encounter. Or sometimes, very artificial situations, you can repeat the encounter. But generally speaking, it's alas impossible to repeat the encounter. And if you don't do what was necessary in the encounter, we cannot repeat the scene. But it's a general structure of an event. In an event, we cannot clearly distinguish between apparition and disparition. Apparition and disparition are very close. So, in some sense, and it was my conviction from a long time, but it was a problem. The question is how we can have the consequences of an event when the event itself disappears. So, what are the consequences of a disparition? It was the question of the causality of disparition, the vanishing causality. And it's a question of a trace of the event. The event disappears, but there is in the world a trace, some trace. What is exactly a trace? It's a difficult problem. Alors, I have, in fact, in my first book concerning an event, being an event, I have the first solution to this problem. It is logic in the world, I have a second solution. So I have changed my mind concerning this problem. In being an event, my position is that finally the trace of an event is precisely something like to find a name for the event, to inscribe the event by a name. A name is not exactly a name in the syntactic signification. The name can be the phrase, a book, a description of the event. And so the difficulty was that we have finally two events in one event. First event, the apparition and disparition of the event, but second, the invention of the name. And it was very difficult because finally we have something like two subjects. The first subject, which creates the name for the disparition of the event, and after that, the subject which organizes the consequences of the events, that is, the consequences of the name, in some sense. So my solution was obscure. It was obscure because it was like a double subjectivity in the creation of the consequences of the event. First, to find the name, and second, to constitute the consequences of the event, which is the truth procedure. So there was the subject for name and the subject for truth. And there is no rational reason that it could be the same subject, because the invention of the name is a very particular operation which is completely different than the organization of the consequences. Naturally, in some sense, there is a counter-experience when you think that in the love event, the name, the first name is something like "I love you," or something like that, in this form or in another form. It's the name, maybe the name for the lover himself or herself. And we can, but precisely the subject which is saying "I love you" is not absolutely the subject of love, because the subject of love is the relationship between the two. In fact, the true subject of love is at the level of the two, at the level of the one. But the subject which is saying "I love you" is at the level of the one. It's an attempt of the one to become two, but it's not as a two as such. So even is this very elementary situation, we understand that there is a difficulty because the subject which is naming the event cannot be exactly the subject which is in the consequences of the event. And so, after all, if the subject which say "I love you" is exposed to a failure, something like a false name, if it's not true that the other loves him or her, it's a failure. So finally we have a false encounter or something like that. And so it's clear that the invention of the name cannot be exactly the constitution of the subject of the consequences of the event. In this situation, the love subject as such. So it was something unclear. So in Logic of the World, I propose to say, in a more classical fashion, finally, that there is really a trace of the event itself. And there is the time for the event and the time for the name. The name exists as a trace of the event. We name what is said of the event as a trace immanent to the event, as something like a fact, the point of the event, That's why it's not the event itself, because the event disappears, but there is a trace. And it's not a subjective operation, it's an objective trace. And this trace is the concrete beginning of the subject of the event. And so, by an event, something is said which was unsayable, in fact. The trace is not inscribed in the common language. So all events are with something like linguistic invention, invention in language, newness in language. And for return finish with your example, when in a poem or in a novel we have the experience of an immanent experience of something which is not said inside what is said, it's really that it's an attempt to produce something like an event in the relationship between what is said and what is unsaid. Okay, that is for the first question. Second question was a return to concerning life and death. And you read your question. It's a long question, so pay attention to the question.
In suggesting that the old men and women of the future will transmit a new tradition concerning the relations between life and death, change and tradition, history and nature, you observe that, quote, what is obscure but also promising in ecology is to invent a non-religious question of death. In general, you argue forcefully for the necessity of a new non-religious thinking of death in dialectical opposition to life. This is where I think I must disagree. To begin with, this is subparagraph, I do not think the concepts death and life make an appropriate dialectical pairing. At the level of content, they are not sufficiently dialectical. That is, we can synthesize the data of biology, etc., with the experience of being in order to say something about the content of, quote, life from two opposing positions. But the experience of being can tell us nothing about our own death with regard to its bringing together of opposing modes of knowing, subjective and objective. Quote, death is a half-empty concept, allowing of only an external, quote, objective, etc., description, and not also an internal or phenomenological one. And since our extrapolations from our own experiences of others dying can tell us nothing at all about the experience of dying as such. In short, life, in quotes, is a dialectical concept in itself, while death, in quotes, is not. Second subparagraph. Moreover, in order to think death dialectically, that is, from within and without, both subjectively and objectively, it is necessary to speculate about the experiential content of death, the concept. Such speculation is more or less by definition religious. Indeed, I mean to say that one cannot invent a non-religious question of death because the questioning of death is the fundamental mode of religiosity. Perhaps we would not agree about this when I state it in this manner, so let me make the point another way. If Heidegger could characterize death as the impossibility of possibility, that space where all the possibilities of my being is reaches its point of impossibility, and Levinas could follow with a reversal of the formula, the possibility of impossibility, the possibility that that's thing that Heidegger named is what's at stake when we say the word death, we can, accepting this movement of thought as one from the thinking of death as concrete annihilation of Dasein to the thinking of death as the undefined space of the possibility of such annihilation, treat the word death as simply catachrestic, as always and necessarily reaching beyond itself. Either death is something that happens to others, in which case it is adequately enough described by biology and physics and so on, or it is something that will happen to me, in which case it designates neither more nor less than radical uncertainty. Death offers no traces of experience by which one might speculate about the content of, quote, death. Such speculation, then, is religious. That is, it is axiomatic without also being universally commonsensical. Third.
Yes.
What remains, then, I want to say, is a withdrawal from the very question of quote-unquote death as a concept, or rather a subtraction of that question from our field of thought. This withdrawal would take the form of a substitutive dialectical opposition, one that itself withdraws dialectically from the life-death pairing, and that is in itself more properly dialectical. I would name this somewhat, hastily, the opposition of qualified life to suffering. And I mean to say that this pairing would be what orients ecology at its best. Indeed, orients all contemporary thinking that might serve to invent a new relation between history and nature. I don't want to impose on your generosity, so I'll forbear tracing out what I see as the consequences of such a thinking. But I do want to say two things more. First, what makes this pairing a dialectical withdrawal from, or a dialectical reduction of, quote, life and quote, death. And second, what makes each of these terms dialectical in itself. Sub to that. The life-death pairing presses out beyond the boundaries of dialectical reason, of itself necessarily becoming religious speculation when it takes up the question of death. To retreat a step, then, is to subtract death as a question. But to subtract death, in quotes, as a question, is then necessarily also to subtract something from, quote, life. To subtract what? Life itself, life as itself, life qua life. What is, in quotes, life without life qua life? Or what is, in quotes, life without its nature? It is life as history, qualified life. What then negates qualified life? What else but suffering? Suffering contains within itself the question of the relation of its objective character to its subjective character. It is a concept wholly determined by some dialectical interplay between nature and history, between what is happening to whom or whatever can count as one, can count as a sufferer, and what experience the one counted as sufferer has. So we say the sea slug cannot suffer. It has no central nervous system, no center of experience. There is no there, as Gertrude Stein once noted. But equally, suffering does not at all receive its adequate definition by some description that would be restricted to nervous systems and noxious stimuli. It is equally and necessarily a felt reality dialectically opposed to its ascriptive, objective reality in any particular instance. Likewise, and in the same vein, qualified life, which cannot in any instance be reduced either to the brute fact of living or to the liver's apprehension of being, but concerns always the twinned subjective-objective question of the value and viability of a life. In sum, then, it seems to me that the question for ecology today must be that of the qualified life-suffering pair. This withdrawal from life and death is at once both properly radical and radically continuous, committed to a particular tradition of questioning and to changing the law of change. I suggest this having accepted as valid the rest of your argument as presented. Would you assent to the amendment?
Thank you. Thank you. You have fixed with in Alain a rule. I give my answer, and I explain my answer now, and I give him the last bit. To don't be too oppressive views of my position. Inside. Yes, I really disagree with you. It's not a mystery. And I just explained the points where this disagreement can be clarified. After that, you stay. First, you say that we can synthesize. I take your intervention in the order. It's much more. You say that at the level of content concerning life, we can synthesize the data of biology with the experience of being in order to say something about the content of life from two opposing positions. And that the experience of being can tell us nothing about our own death. I think that from the very beginning this is not exactly true. Not exactly true. First, because to say something about the content of life is not reducible to the possible of synthesis of the data of biology and so on. There is a difference probably in the concept of life at this level. For me, when I speak of life, the opposition of life and death, it's not at all in reference to purely biological concept of life. It's from the very beginning what we name a qualified life at the end. So the opposition between life and death is, from the very beginning, not only an opposition between what we can say biologically of life and what we can say objectively or subjectively concerning death. All the two terms are of historical nature. And life is not life in its natural sense, but life in the sense which is, it's a sense of our experience, natural and historical. So, to resume this point, I think that we can be on the same level when we say, you and me, that by life, we must understand historical life. That is love of human being in all its dimensions. Dimensions of biological survival of the body, but also symbolic, historical, social, political determination of existence. And from the very beginning, I don't completely understand why you reduce the possibility to have something to think concerning death to our personal experience of death. It's a point we have yesterday, but I cannot understand exactly why, concerning precisely death, you want absolutely that all knowledge, all possible knowledge, is the personal experience of death. After all, we know many things without any personal experience. Why death will be a pure exception? For example, we perfectly know the death of the others, and why the knowledge of the death of the others cannot be a true knowledge of death, after all. Why? It's by necessity only our proper experience of death, which is a true knowledge of death. I think this limitation would be terrible if we proceed with that sort of limitation in another field or about another term than death. And as I have said, there is many means to communicate the experience of the death of the other, to think the experience of death of the other. And when you say that death is something which happens to me, it's true in some sense, but we know that for me also, death is something which happens to something else. Once death can happen to something else, to somebody else, maybe, and happens to me because it happens to somebody else. So there is also an experience of death by the mediation of the death of the other, a personal experience of death by the experience of the death of the other. So it's a point concerning the possibility of a knowledge of death and maybe of a sort of experience of death, which is certainly not the personal immanent experience of death, because death is precisely the end of the possibility of personal experience. But this is the interdiction of some knowledge of death as such. When you say, for example, death allowing of only an external objective description and not a phenomenological one, certainly, but there is, it's not an intrinsic limitation of knowledge by itself. There is many parts of knowledge which are not knowledge of phenomenological or intimate nature, but which are true knowledge. If you want to, the disagreement here is of epistemological nature in some sense. The question of the possible existence of a concept of death, which is really a field of experience and knowledge in the true sense, even if, in fact, we cannot have an experience of the pure end of our experience, naturally. It is a tautology. So, after that, we have also disagreement concerning dialectics. When you say that in order to think death dialectically, that is from within and without, both subjectively and objectively. But the relationship between subjective and objective is only an example of a dialectical process. It's not an intrinsic definition of a dialectical. A dialectical process is the process of negativity, or the process of a contradiction. Certainly, the contradiction of subjectivity and objectivity is one of possible contradictions. There is many dialectical processes which are not the relationship between subjective and objective. For example, the dialectical process between history and nature cannot be reduced to a form of dialectical process between subjectivity and objectivity, because there is something objective in history too, and in some sense, in nature, there is also something subjective. So, I think this definition of dialecticity is too narrow. It's too narrow, really. And I return to this point. Either death is something that happens to others, in which case it is adequately enough described by biology and physics, or it is something that will happen to me, in which case it designates nothing. I think that the proposition is false, really false. But in these two parts, either death is something that happens to others, in which case it is adequately enough described by biology and physics, not at all precisely. Not at all, because biology and physics in some way the description precisely of the objective part of death and the transmission of the subjective part of death, that is the process of death, the experience of the death, and so on, is not relevant by biology and physics, and all our problem, in fact. I think we know much more things concerning death in literature, in cinema, than in biology and physics, because biology and physics are only the explanation of the fact that death is the hand of life. We can give some. So at this point too, there is something between objectivity and subjectivity which is unclear for me. Unclear for me. We can have some transmission of the subjective relationship to death, which is of great importance concerning the question of death. And it's, this point is disagreement at the level not of purely epistemological question, but at the level of dialectics in general, and in the particular case of the possibility of something concerning death. After that, I disagree too with the opposition of qualified life and suffering. Now, it is because by qualified life, I think maybe your definition is incomplete here. I agree with you. It's a possibility. So it's not a critique. But qualified life signifies historical life. You say that. Historical life, that is the life we take historical form, and not the life precisely at the pure biological level of life. So, as I have said, qualified life is what I name life. So, it's a precision. And I cannot understand why suffering is the name of the dialectical polarity with qualified life, because in my opinion, suffering is possible part of qualified life, simply. I don't understand why suffering, why you isolate suffering, which is a part of any form of life, and especially of historical life, why we take this modality of experience as a term of a new dialectics. I think that we cannot do that without thinking that qualified life signifies something which is outside suffering. So the good life, the good life in the sense that the good life is a life which is not by itself exposed to suffering. And so we have a dialectical relationship between qualified life and suffering. I think that this vision is really inside our world. It's my most strong critique. I think you have, because inside our world, in fact, the specific form of qualified life is in fact the good life. And we can say in some sense that good life is in opposition to suffering. But for me, for example, qualified life is not at all reducible to an opposition to suffering. In fact, if, for example, we define a true qualified life as a life which is exposed to the possibility of the process of a truth, or a life which is in relationship to an idea, and so on, suffering can be purely and simply a part of the process, an acceptation of the process, and not something which is outside the life. And so, if you reduce the question of the opposition of life and death, of the opposition between qualified life and suffering, in my opinion, you assume a world, objective and subjective, which is our contemporary world. In fact, we can explain today that dominant opinion is that we must have a qualified life, that is a historical life, which is without suffering. And so it's a dialectical vision, which is a dialectical vision, in my sense, which is specific of the particular world, which is our world. It was like the question of yesterday. It's the vision of the world without any heroism. Because heroism is precisely the acceptation of suffering in the vision of what is a qualified life, certainly. So, there is another most objective difficulty, that is, in some sense, suffering cannot be a dialectical polarity for the opposition between historical life and nature, because it's evident that suffering is on the two sides. Suffering is a term, there is suffering of historical nature, which is the oppressive by the state, the war, the torture, and so on, and there is suffering which is absolutely of biological nature, which is illness, suffering. So I cannot understand why you choose suffering as a dialectical term inside the possibility of a new dialectics between historicity and nature. And so I literally cannot understand the sentence, what negates qualified life, what else but suffering? I cannot understand. I think that suffering cannot be the negation of qualified life, except inside a very weak conception of qualified life. And so I can stop here, but just to have a synthesis of all that. I think that the disagreement is first of epistemological nature, because brutally concerning death, you are absolutely in empiricism. That is, there is no truth of something if we have no personal and sensible experience of the fact of the experience. I think it's not true for death, as it's not true for everything. And after that, we have the disagreement concerning the world in which we are saying that something is acceptable or true. And it's the vision of the position of suffering. I think that that suffering cannot be a theoretical question. Suffering is a question inside the vision of qualified life, which is the vision of our world. Happiness, harmony, and so on. No suffering. That is the vision of life without any idea. You have the last word.
So, initially, I thought you were very generous to give me the last word. I still do. And you've attacked me most on the point that's weakest, which is good, which is the suffering bit. It's the part that I'm least committed to. Although, I think most of your attack hinges on actually a difference in the way that we define suffering, rather than a difference in the way that we would define qualified life. Some sort of extremely weak, what did you say, a very weak conception of qualified life. I don't think actually the disagreement about the relation between qualified life and suffering lies there, in my weak conception of qualified life, but rather in you and I using, I think, quite different conceptions of suffering. And that's, in a sense, the least important to me. The thing that I think really matters most is precisely about death as a concept. So, keep track. And I'm going to skip over the first couple of things that you said about qualified life and come back if it's a reasonable time. The main thing is that you equivocate, I think, in the way that you approach death. So you say, and I think it's a very important equivocation. Like it's, on the one hand, of course I have an experience of death. Of course, and it's true, and you're right. Of course I do. People pass away. I identify with them. And you said this to Mara, to her question yesterday. You know, we identify with people as they're passing away. We have this very strong, constant experience of death along a number of different axes. And of course, I have to say, yes, it's completely true. I wouldn't argue with that at all. But what's interesting from my perspective isn't that for the question of an opposition of life and death. That's interesting for the question of how we constitute communities. We have to have ways of responding to the experience of loss that we name death. Totally. That's good. You said we would be uncivilized if we didn't yesterday. We might have different ideas about what constitutes civilization, but I basically agree. I think there's some necessity of symbolizing the experience of loss that we have thus far called death. My point, though, is really different. It's that what we call death is a way of naming something that's radically uncertain. And it's radically uncertain precisely because the experience of identifying with somebody who is in the process of dying reaches its conclusion as experience of identification at the point that we name death, maybe before. And it's true that there's, though I wouldn't say empiricism, I'd say there's a materialist commitment there, and there's, I would want to say that when we're talking about the experience part of the sort of objective subjective binary, I'll come back to that in a sec. We want to talk about something that materially can occur. So, for instance, your example yesterday, and again today, was the novel. Would I think that I can't write a novel about something that I have no experience about? Yes, of course I can. Of course. But I can write about a novel about something that I have no experience of because materially, from a fundamental material...
Just a point. You said I have no experience, but you must... must decide. I have no personal experience. Because...
C'est vrai. Okay, I
Say
have...
personal experience.
Please.
Always. I have no personal experience.
I accept the amendment. I think that's fair.
It's a point.
Yeah, it's a good point. No, so one can write a novel about something one has no personal experience of, precisely because the set of experiences that would define the world of the novel exist within the domain of materiality, broadly speaking. The experience of dying, there is no such thing that anybody has that we know within where we are. Now, we actually don't know that nobody has either. I'm radically agnostic on this point. Absolutely agnostic. I have no idea whatsoever. For all I know, the Christians are right, and the Mormons, there's 3 different kinds of heaven, and you can visit between this kind and not, and so on. I have no idea. The point for me is that this is the space of radical uncertainty. And interestingly, and I have to say, I think symptomatic of your stance in this disagreement.
We have no idea uniquely because it's the end of subjectivity. So
perhaps
we cannot have an idea, but precisely we have the idea that it's the death of subjectivity. It's sufficient. It's sufficient.
Nous le croyons.
To be inscribed in a knowledge, in a symbolization, in a very important question, and so on.
We believe this to be the case.
To say that something is the end of something is a perfect knowledge of something. It's not the absence of idea, it's precisely the idea
but
as such.
That itself is a belief that's not supported by anything but another set of beliefs. There's no axiomatic basis for that.
After, that is the religious question.
So when you say that death is the end of subjectivity, what we're left with is either we say, yes, I believe you, it's the end of subjectivity, which one can say, or we say, no, I don't believe you, or we say, as I do, I'm radically uncertain about what we want to signify. What would be the referent? Think of what would be the referent of the
uncertainty. Uncertainty. You perfectly know that the death is the end of the subjective historical existence.
No.
Maybe we can affirm that there is something after and so on, but it's the end of the historical existence of the subject as such. It's perfectly clear.
It's the end.
There is no uncertainty.
It's
because the question of the existence after is an unhistorical question. It's a question of religious symbolization. That's tautological.
That's only the case if, in fact, you're correct about what you're asserting. And what I'm saying is we have no way of knowing. So take by example, and it's a very vulgar example, but take a small group of people living in the countryside of Minnesota who don't know anybody outside of their little area. And for them, it is absolutely the end of subjectivity is to leave Minnesota. There is no subjectivity outside of Minnesota. And perhaps they're right. But we would want to say we think they're not.
You maintain, in fact, the religious hypothesis.
No.
Yes,
I maintain an uncertainty. I maintain that precisely what the meaning of death would be, what death would be as something that's meaning, that one takes on, assumes oneself, precisely that is what remains in question. And remains in question in a way that doesn't allow of being questioned within sort of a dialectical worldview. This is my point. And now, when you say that I'm maintaining the religious hypothesis, that would be true if I were saying it is the case that what we experience as somebody leaving the subjective community is not really so. That's the religious hypothesis. And I don't affirm that at all. I have no opinion on that. I have no idea.
Then what remains uncertain about it?
What remains uncertain about it?
It's the most certain.
No, you're looking at it from the wrong direction. When you say it's the most certain thing, you're 100% correct from one direction. And that's all you have is that
That's where you're
direction.
maintaining the religious side.
No.
Yeah.
It's not where I'm beginning the religious side. It's where I'm saying the question of what that direction means is not necessarily a religious question unless one insists on answering it. The second one answers that.
Insist on answering something that you will never. It's the end of the end. It's the end. So how can you return from the end to analyze?
This is a circular logic. It's
That's
the end,
an
therefore you
alternative.
can't ask about what happens after the end, therefore it's the end. That's not a logic. If you say it's the end, therefore you can't ask about what it is.
No, but
That's not what I'm saying.
in my opinion, the death is our most certain conviction. there is no discussion possible. Nobody say, "Ah, no, it's not dead." It's a true example of something which is absolutely certain in the death. And so there is no obscurity.
No.
You have obscurity except if you are in the religious question, naturally. The survival of the soul and so on. And it's a basis of something which is a very division of the life itself between the life of the mortal part, which is the body, and the life of the soul. No. But if you have not this religious point, we have the certitude of the death, always.
No, I think that in insisting on that binary, you're maintaining a position that, and I would quote you here, I think this vision is really inside the world to maintain that binary. The idea that there must be a certainty about what the signification of the term death is what I'm wanting to withdraw from. I'm not wanting to offer it a different signification. I'm saying that to insist that one can have, and you, of course, that there is some point in the sort of metonymic movement of signification, and that point is death. And at that point, all other signification is anchored because we know what that point means, is to me logically unsupportable. Now one can assert it, and I can't say, no, you're wrong, you must be wrong, because my position doesn't allow me to say that. But it's logically insupportable. All you can point to is experience, and it's, I have to say, I think you here who become empiricists.
I don't understand really, but you have the last word.
No.
I cannot understand it. For me, there is no obscurity of mystery at all in the fact of death. It's a perfectly clear fact. And there is no discussion, there is no division. There is division only if you are under some religious hypothesis. If there is no religious hypothesis, so it's you which is religious and not me. Because the question of death is not at all a religious question, in fact. The question of death is the historical question of what are we doing in the context of everybody must die. And it's a certainty, it's an absolute certainty. And so the question of the historical signification of this natural fact is our question. And during many centuries, this very evident question, what are we saying historically, culturally, with symbolic form, and so on, concerning this evident and maybe important fact that by nature we are mortal. What are we doing of that is an historical question, naturally. And I don't understand why we don't accept that it is a question. You are obliged to say that we cannot have this question, to say that there is an uncertainty which cannot exist. There is no uncertainty concerning death as such. And so my problem is not the possibility of mental experimentation concerning the death as such, because I know perfectly that death is precisely the end of exam. And there is no experience of death if experience signifies a personal and intimate experience. It's known for a very long time. But death exists, that is the point. And it's precisely the relationship between death and historical destiny of human being, which is my question. And not suffering. There is no relation between suffering and death. Suffering can be love suffering, suffering in historical adventure, suffering by illness, suffering and so on. You cannot substitute suffering to death. It's a completely different problem.
So,
and you substitute suffering to death only because you maintain that death is a mystery.
No, it's no.
We cannot do anything, cannot say anything concerning death. Is the concept apte
And to maintain that to maintain that death is a mystery is to affirm its continued value as a question. And what I'm saying is that the question of the meaning of death, or what would be signified by the term death. Now, when you say
the term death is perfectly clear.
Please,
what is signified by the term death is perfectly clear.
What is signified by the term
there is
death?
no question about this.
What is signified by the term death
is clear word.
Is perfectly clear. Is perfectly clear insofar as it's not dialectical, as it doesn't have.
It is how to live the question of how to die. It is exactly dialectical. This is the point.
No, you're not really grasping what I'm saying. The question of death.
I think that where you're going is the question of birth.
Yeah,
that's on the other side of death. And that is the uncertainty. No, I mean, I'm serious.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to cut in on it. But death is what he just said, that death is what you cannot experience. It exists, but nobody can experience it. So what you're looking for is an answer to a question that is a void. It's precisely this, like, there's nothing there, but there's something on the other side.
And
That's the question.
And uncertainty too. It is also
What about the
making
other side?
What I'm saying. Let me try very, very simply. I'll say it one more time. Pour la dernière fois.
It's a good struggle.
La dernière fois. Ce serait pas. Okay.
It's the living existence of death, finally, today.
So.
What are you saying simply?
What we mean when we say the word death, what we point to. Let's say that we use the word as a pointer of sorts. It points to something. It points to some set of differences. It refers in some way, it predicates, it signifies. We're pointing to the fact that collectively we experience members of the community of subjectivity ceasing to be radically and absolutely, in our experience, members of the community of subjectivity. On this, I think we agree absolutely. And this, if anything can be named a fact that's unquestionable, surely that can. So on this much we agree. My point is that to be a properly dialectical concept, to be a concept that's driven by an internal opposition, I mean a Begriff in the Hegelian sense, death would have to actually not be something that admits of a perfectly clean, final cut answer. And without instantiating any religious hypothesis at all, it's enough simply to say, and this I think is a really reasonable thing to say, on what logical grounds do we affirm that this collective experience is in fact the totality of what can be placed under the concept death? And I would say we have no grounds for affirming that. In any logical sense, we can affirm it empirically, and I'm a materialist. I actually don't really believe in life after death. I'm agnostic about all the other things because I find it doesn't harm me to be agnostic, and it doesn't seem to do any other larger harm. But really, very seriously, what we're naming, what we're saying is a fact, is an ineluctable fact, is something that we agree on, and I'm saying that something is precisely not an adequate content for the concept death, if death is to be a dialectical concept in its own internal being. That
you have the last word.
I have.
So, for tomorrow, read the poem.